I came to sort of the conclusion that interaction effects tend to be overestimated. They're number one, they're actually quite rare. And then when they're found, they're actually in most cases underwhelming. In such a way that they generally still produce directionally accurate results. So it wouldn't change your decision over whether to ship a feature. It would just change your estimate of what that effect, true effect is. So I think in some ways, folks who are really worried about interaction effects are really making too much of a big deal.
Hey folks, it's Richard here from Experiment Nation, and today I've got Tim Chan on the line here. Tim is a former data scientist from Facebook. We're going to be talking about his experiences at StatSig and covering a few topics such as when it's okay to overlap or isolate tests, the concept of interaction effects between tests being overblown, and much more. So stay tuned. Today I've got a special guest. Welcome to the show, Tim.
Hi, Richard. Thank you so much for having me.
Cool. So how about we just start it off with, you got an interesting background. I can see you were previously working in various scientific roles that weren't particularly to do with experimentation specifically. Maybe just talk about what kind of sparked your interest to get involved as a data scientist and experimentation at Facebook.
Yeah, I think I've had a pretty interesting career path, like a lot of other data scientists. For me, I love science. I love scientific thinking. And that's sort of what led me to pursue sort of a career in the biotech space and doing medical research. But another part of me was also really interested in startups, really interested in business. And what I had always thought was my dream job was combining sort of the scientific principles and scientific decision-making and thinking and analytics to the business world. That kind of role didn't really exist when I graduated with my PhD, but I think I slowly became aware of this career called the data scientist. And that is my interpretation of what a data scientist is that it's applying scientific principles and scientific methods to actually deriving pretty solid insights that can make sound business decisions. And so once I found that out, I really wanted to become a data scientist. Had to learn a little bit of Python, SQL, things like that. And Facebook was my first role, my first bona fide role as a data scientist.
It's huge jump from, was it Galvanize that you were working on? Oh, okay, so Galvanize was basically kind of you segueing into data science, and then you segued into the tech sector via Facebook. Facebook's a huge company. What area within Facebook were you working within?
So when I first started, I joined in 2016, which Facebook was quite a bit smaller, but it was already a public company.
Yeah.
By then, so it was still, by all means, still very much a big tech company at that point. The first team I joined was on Facebook Gaming. Classically, this was known as sort of the team that had been responsible for things like Farmville. It sort of had like a bit of a tarnished legacy internally at Facebook, also externally. But our job on that team was to sort of make gaming relevant again on Facebook in a way that played very nicely with users and other Facebook content. So, and that was a team that was very much growth focused. So we were in charge of sort of making things more relevant for like a younger group of Facebook users, but also make Facebook a cool place for gaming content to be sort of shared and be active.
And I mean, in terms of the Facebook gaming division that you're part of, I mean, and the growth associated with that, were you specifically just bringing it back to experimentation? Like, how was your role tangibly involved in experimentation and growth in that sort of area?
I didn't.
And feel free to discuss any things that you feel safe to maybe share in terms of specifics.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think this was my first role as a data scientist, and the way I would describe the role I had was it was more like product analytics, but sort of kicked up a notch in terms of the scientific savviness. And what I've come to learn was you can do a lot of deriving insights from existing data and diving in and applying some statistical methods. But what I quickly found was one of the most powerful tools in the arsenal of Facebook product teams was experimentation. The ability to instead of sort of like coming up with analyses that have all sorts of caveats and assumptions, you could actually put ideas to the test in a very quick fashion, where you just deploy it as a test, get results back in 2 weeks, and immediately know whether that idea was good or bad. And the team was, and this was true of all Facebook culture, was folks were exceptionally data driven. So being the data driven data scientist wasn't necessarily a key advantage at Facebook. Like, everybody was data driven, but helping the team sort of navigate insights and sort of being able to dive into the harder questions, especially with experimental effects, was sort of my role.
And in saying that, I mean, do you mind kind of explain maybe tangibly the experimentation culture? Like, it wasn't just a team of experimenters. Like, it sounds like you have product managers, maybe marketers internally in the team that could basically have an experiment and I'd have a hypothesis and ideate an experiment and launch it on their own right. I'm guessing there was there like democratization of experimentation within Facebook as a whole? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's a great term for democratizing, because I felt like at Facebook, every engineer, product manager, and data scientist was really empowered to set up, run, and own the experiment. I had even seen like interns, within 3 weeks of them starting at Facebook, like knowing how to set up an experiment by themselves and be able to operate that. And so this was like really cool to see. And part of that was just because Facebook tooling was made experimentation easy. I know a lot of folks who do experimentation today think that there's a lot of heavy lift you have to do in terms of like making sure that you have your assignment correct, that things are balanced, that you have metrics flowing in, that you're ready for the computations, that you have things like your hypothesis set up. But for a lot of things, I've seen like people make one-line code changes and even put that behind an A/B test. And they may make a decision in 3 or 4 days just to make sure that it indeed fixed the bug. But what I thought was really cool was that Facebook was definitely biased towards measuring outcomes instead of just assuming those would come out. And that was done through experimentation.
I mean, was it, may I ask, was like, because, you typically have a roadmap and prioritize your experiments in a typical environment. I mean, we're talking about Facebook here, which is not your atypical, not your typical business. It's very atypical. Was there any sort of ways to, I don't know, prioritize tests within, say, the game, Facebook gaming, and be, you said like people could have an idea and launch it pretty quickly. Was there any internal QA by engineers and those sort of things, just to sort of make sure that there was like sort of a certain degree of quality control? Yeah,
we're based in Seattle, and I was part of Facebook Seattle. And what's really kind of neat here is in Seattle, Microsoft is sort of like the big legacy tech giant in this area.
Yeah,
and Facebook is sort of like the new, sort of like the new up and coming, like new, and the two companies, at least we had a lot of folks who went from Microsoft to Facebook, and there was a big culture shift, especially with regards to how Facebook approached experimentation and QA. For example, like the old way of doing software development was you would go through layers and layers and levels of QA. You'd have large QA teams. Facebook did not. Facebook believed very much in engineers owning their own QA. So like you would build the feature, but you would also own the fact that like you had done your due diligence and checks. Now, obviously, you don't have the ability to test on like 80 different Android devices, your feature. But Facebook relied on experimentation as how it would make the final judgment. So in some ways, the end user was the QA, and you would look for things like, I mean, at its simplest level, like you would look at things like, hey, I deployed this new line of code. Did crash rates, for example, change? And if they did, what are the set of devices that might have occurred on? I think that was a big part of it. I think also, I'll just go back to your first point of like how Facebook sort of approached roadmaps. Facebook roadmaps were, at least goals, were very much outcome driven and not necessarily going through a set of tasks and projects to complete. And I'm told that this sort of is divergent from somehow other companies approach things. So we would have a goal in Facebook gaming that, for example, we may strive to improve retention rate of certain users with certain class of games or with certain products. Or we might strive to be like this product needs to achieve this many daily active users at the end of the half. And so things were very measured and data-driven and metrics-driven outcomes. And we would come up with a list of ideas on how we could achieve those metric goals. And those ideas were very flexible in how we approach them. Like, we may think we entered the half with a clear idea of like the following 5 items, if we finish them, would achieve it. But the second we test the first item and we find out it doesn't work, but we actually learn from why that doesn't work, that can actually throw your entire roadmap out the door, because you suddenly think that, oh, I have a new way that we think we can achieve the goals. So I would say like the roadmap of items that we wanted to accomplish were very much in flux, and we were willing to pivot based on new data.
It was quite flexible. It wasn't like, no, we've got this test line up next month from them, like a rigid roadmap.
Yeah, I would say the way we would prioritize, like, we weren't rigid in terms of scheduling. You wouldn't have a set of tests queued up and say like, we're going to execute the following 5 tests in the following sequence. Instead, things were very much driven on what knowledge do we have today and which tests do we think are the most impactful. And those ones would be prioritized first. So everything was very much focused on the goal you were trying to achieve, and which tests were most likely to drive that outcome.
How does your role specifically work in terms of being a data scientist with testing and the statistical results and so forth? Like, let's just say someone they ran a test, they ran a bit of code, they had the outcome of a test after 2 weeks. What do you do as a data scientist?
Yeah, I would say there's 2 parts or 2 ways that a data scientist can influence experimentation, at least how I saw it work at Facebook. The first is really helping to prioritize a list of ideas and experiments that one could run. And that could be looking at things like, if we wanted to improve the conversion rate on a certain page, like being able to identify which pages have low conversion rates and believing that there's an opportunity to drive those up. Or if you wanted to drive users to a certain surface or a product, like, where are the biggest opportunities for that? So I think a data scientist was quite instrumental in being able to quantify an opportunity size, which sort of projects or experiments teams should be focusing on. I think that, and the second one is helping to interpret experimental results. I think Facebook, as I mentioned, the company was very data savvy. So like, engineers were fully capable and PMs were very capable of interpreting most experiments by themselves, particularly the ones where like there's a clear outcome and a key metric. But where a data scientist was probably most helpful was in those cases where sometimes results were contradictory, or sometimes you had metrics that moved in odd ways, and being able to sort of discern what is the possible root cause of some of these effects, and being able to dive deeper into the data, or being able to understand a little bit of like the principles of experimentation and how that applies.
You wrote an article about how maybe overlapping tests isn't as bad as it is, and I'm guessing your experience with Facebook, it sounds like they had a sort of culture of having overlapping tests and not worrying too much about the noise effects of that. Could you explain that a bit more, please?
Yeah. So, I'm classically trained as a scientist, and I know one of the fundamentals of science when you're doing comparisons, is particularly in experimentation, is you want to sort of control for every factor and make sure you're comparing apples to apples. But what I quickly found was, in the world of product-based experimentation, that just fundamentally doesn't work. And part of the reason is that like, when you're experimenting at that level of scale, like let's say Facebook is running 10,000 experiments. I don't know what the actual number is, but that's not an unreasonable estimate. If you assume every test is actually like an A/B test split at 50-50, that's actually 2 to the power of 50 combinations. There's not enough users in the world to make sure that everybody is represented properly. And so the only way to sort of achieve that scale of experimentation really is to overlap. But the other advantage that companies who are doing online experimentation have is really large sample sizes. And what I mean by really large is like, in the world of statistics, like 30 was considered like a normal size experiment. Anything over that, like 100, was considered well powered. In the world of online experimentation, we're talking about like tens of thousands of users. That's actually plenty to where, if you were to split that 50-50, and actually split that many times 50-50, you would actually end up with fairly representative buckets just by pure randomization. And that is all fine in theory. But what I did see at Facebook was that we were able to overlap experiments quite regularly. And even in times where you would swear up and down that like these two experiments, just by their nature, have to be overlapping, have to have interaction effects. I found that every time we looked into those, they were very underwhelming. I came to sort of the conclusion that interaction effects tend to be overestimated. They're number one, they're actually quite rare. And then when they're found, they're actually in most cases underwhelming. In such a way that they generally still produce directionally accurate results. So it wouldn't change your decision over whether to ship a feature. It would just change your estimate of what that true effect is. So I think in some ways, folks who are really worried about interaction effects are really making too much of a big deal. And it's actually slowing their rate of experimentation. You're now severely underpowering all your experiments because you are trying to keep users in separate buckets. And I've found that this is probably an effect that folks who aren't used to experimenting at scale, I think it's usually the first thing they worry about. It's a question we get a lot at StatSig.
I mean, it's a question that I've had because, I've just been going by other sort of blogs and having this very purist perspective that, you want to put them into separate buckets to avoid the noise effects and interaction effects between tests, and it's sort of like a purist thing. But I think I remember Ronnie Kahavi from was it Microsoft or Bing? At that time, he was saying through MVT tests, multivariate testing, that the interaction effects between several components in a test aren't as high as you think, and I think that's sort of going along the same line of as you're saying. Would you say that these interaction effects, your assertion that they're not as bad as you think, would you say that even applies to, say, I don't know, a small scale website of maybe say it's got 100,000 new visitors per month?
One thing I've learned at StatSig, and I didn't have this perspective necessarily before, is you don't actually need that many users to do experimentation properly. What we quickly found, like 100,000 monthly active users is larger than your average StatSig customer by far. And I remember we would get some of these customers who initially signed up and tried StatSig that may have 10,000 users, for example. And the scientist in me sort of said oh my God, they're about to try experimentation. They're going to walk away pretty underwhelmed and very frustrated.
You're saying 10,000 users overall, not just the one page. We're talking about the whole website gets 10,000 uniques per month.
Overall. And I remember I was used to Facebook scale experiment, and I had worked at small products at Facebook, but even small products at Facebook would have 50,000 users, 100,000 users. And so I would see these small companies, and not only that, these folks didn't have a ton of experience with experimentation, and they were getting started. And so I think in some ways, in the back of my mind, I felt like the cards were stacked against them. But what I had quickly learned, and this was repeated over and over, was that most of these companies who are startups, who are just starting to grow and starting to do experimentation, they ended up succeeding. They ended up with these wildly impressive results, like plus 50% wins, plus 80% wins. And it happened very routinely. And after a while, I came to realize the reason was because at Facebook, we would struggle to find 2% wins, 1% wins. And the reason my conclusion was they're working on unoptimized products. They're just starting to actually rigorously test ideas. They may have done design choices when they were first building their product or website, which just may have been let's just pick something and go with it. And now they're going back and actually trying to test these ideas with metrics and get good measurement. And because their products are unoptimized, there's a ton of low-hanging fruit. There's just a ton of opportunities to operate here, and they're not looking for 1% win, 2% wins. In fact, I would argue any startup that has aspirations of becoming a big deal, if they're looking for 2% wins, they're in trouble. They're never going to hit any sort of growth goals. They need to be looking for big wins. And so they are, and they do find them. And so I was pretty shocked and surprised that these companies were finding these big wins. It was interesting to see results that were like measurements of plus 50% increase on conversion rates. The error margins would be like plus or minus 25%, but like that was enough to be statistically significant, enough for them to be quite happy with the product, that they were getting pretty good measurements and being able to make very clean decisions. So I think it's a myth that you need large sample sizes to do experimentation. I think what is clearly the bigger effect is like whether you are looking is whether those opportunities exist or not. If you have a highly optimized product and have a very low sample size, then the cards are stacked against you. But I think for a lot of people starting out their experimentation journey, that low hanging fruit does exist. They just haven't tried it yet.
I mean, why don't you, because I've kind of kept to like, okay, this sort of heuristic of, okay, we need at least 10,000 uniques to this landing page or so forth to get a general sort of like test that's not underpowered. Would you say that there still has to be some sort of minimum sort of sample size for a particular test or size or page you want to test on?
I'm not a fan of hard and fast rules for like what's the minimum sample size you need for experiments. I think there's a lot of factors that go into it, such as what is the metric you've chosen to measure, how precise is that metric, and what is the minimum detectable effect you think you can achieve. I think those things tend to get overlooked if you just go with sample size. And part of it is also knowing your product. There are times where a metric is noisy. There are ways to find surrogate metrics. There are ways to find metrics that are better behaved in experimentation that may give you a better chance at getting the necessary experimental power. But I'm not a fan of hard and fast rules. I've seen experiments as small as 1,000 users come up with some pretty nice results. And it's just a matter of what is it you're trying to measure and what is your chance there. I think I know in the world of like CRO, metrics tend to be things like click-through rates on buttons. And those things can be a little bit more challenging to move at times. But sometimes if you're looking at driving things like retention, driving things at like number of purchases, driving things at how long somebody's spending on a session, those sort of metrics can sometimes be a little bit more powerful and easier to move. Sometimes not. So I do encourage folks to sort of like look at a wider set of metrics, but I wouldn't write off any sort of sample size or traffic. I would try to instead focus on what is the top line effect you're looking for.
Just sort of backtracking, I know you working at Facebook before. What sort of led you to start Statsig, and also what learnings from Facebook did you bring over to Statsig?
A lot of folks who've worked in big tech that has a really strong experimentation program probably have the same observation that I did. And many of the folks here at Statsig certainly had that observation as well. It's that experimentation can work at a very large scale and be exceptionally powerful at a company. And so what we had seen at Facebook was a set of internal tools Facebook had really did sort of like three things to the company. Number one, it made experimentation accessible just by making it easy to use and a good default. Like everybody there wasn't a good reason to not ship an idea as an experiment.
Yeah.
The second thing that was sort of unique was experiments. Everybody could interpret experiments. And part of it is finding a way to walk that line of, null hypotheses, p-values, confidence intervals. These are all like somewhat challenging concepts. But at the heart, in terms of guiding people to making the correct decision, that is doable. And we certainly saw that at Facebook. And I think the third result really is when you make experimentation easy and you make metrics really accessible, the results just become automatic, sort of like checking in daily as a dashboard. Mm-hmm. And this really, to me, made Facebook a data-driven company. I think without experimentation, Facebook would not have been data-driven. I think that's true at a lot of other companies. And I'm not the only one that's had this observation that experimentation really is how you get everybody bought in on following data, on following metrics, and making data-driven, not opinion-driven decisions. And I think that was great in setting the culture, that it became a culture of ideas and results, not so much of opinions and who could put together well thought out arguments that were polished.
Obviously, you joined a startup. It's been over 2 years now. Definitely, did you just want to join a startup, or did they just ping you on LinkedIn, or?
I've always had an interest in doing startups, but I think my list of when I did an MBA
Yep.
many years ago, and I actually majored in entrepreneurship and was very well familiar with startups. And I sort of came to two conclusions. One is that not all startups are equal, that there is such a thing as a startup that already has success in its DNA.
Mm.
But the second conclusion I came to was that I would never ever find such a startup that I was comfortable enough joining. That that became I was sort of proven wrong in the latter because it was a group of folks who I worked with previously at Facebook had approached me to and asked me if I wanted to join a startup. And these were folks I had a tremendous amount of respect for. I really enjoyed working with, and I knew that sort of success tends to follow certain people. And
Yeah.
this group was one I was willing to bet my career on. So that's how I got convinced to join StatSig, but also the fundamental idea that we can make experimentation and product development tools really easy to use, really accessible, and put in the hands of small, medium, and large companies was to me is just fundamentally something I saw work at Facebook, and I think is pretty exciting to unleash on the rest of the world.
And I'm guessing to build a experimentation platform from scratch is quite a thing. I mean, were you highly involved in developing the stats engine? Yeah, could you talk about the development of that?
Gotcha. Yeah, we have a stats engine. We have an internal name. It's called the Metrics Maestro, but externally we call that results page Pulse Results. So we do show people their experimental results, and and we tell people like check your pulse. That's where the sort of the term comes from. But yeah, I think for me, I was the first data scientist at this company. It was myself and 7 engineers. The CEO is also very much an engineer at heart. So it's 7 engineers and 1 data scientist. I was in charge of sort of the data architecture and building the experimentation engine. But also not only that, helping design how does experimentation fit into StatSig? How should results be displayed that makes statistics accessible and in a way that's informative and not misleading? That is actually, I think, one of our biggest challenges as a company is like we're actually putting in the hands of our users some pretty powerful statistical tools. And it's very important to us that they guide people to best practices and they guide people to make the right decisions. And that's hard to do, but it's something that we think about very much day to day. And that's something which I view very much as one of the focus of a data scientist at StatSig.
So maybe if you could, I hope this doesn't get too technical for our audiences or even me, to be honest. Are you able to explain your stats engine to a certain degree to our audiences in a somewhat not overly laden stat-driven way?
Sure. Yeah, I can. Why don't I tell you like our design philosophy? We try very hard, and we do not have any black magic in our stats engine. The statistical methods that we've employed are very much industry best practices, and we know that because we meet with other experimentation thought leaders at other big tech companies. But we stick with experimentation best practices. We stick with very standard frequentist readouts and methods. We highly encourage our customers to reproduce our results so that they know how our stats engine works. And that can only be done when we stick to like standard best practices. We have a few things that that enhance statistical significance, such as Windsorization. We also have Cupid, which is the pre-experimental bias correction. But these sort of things have become standardized and best practices for all top experimentation platforms, and we have incorporated those methods into our tooling.
Because sometimes, like, I can be a bit wary with certain experimentation platforms calling it a winner or loser too early. Does your platform do that? Does it say, hey, does it ultimately declare there's a winner? And what sort of guardrails have you put in place?
So I think first off, most of our customers are doing what I would call product-based experiments.
Yeah.
This is a little bit different than the world of marketing and CROs in that I think product-based experimentation is what Facebook does. It's what you do when you are actually building a product and you care about things like time spent, retention, and user engagement metrics, and you care about long-term effects. For example, if you are Amazon, converting somebody to a purchase today is maybe an objective, but getting somebody to stay a customer for an entire year should be the goal. Like that is actually what matters to Amazon and what they care about. And so for them, we view that as more of a product-based metric, is sort of tracking these long-term things. I think in sort of these products, metrics and how the product works can be sometimes complicated and can very rarely be boiled down to a single metric. For example, Amazon probably tracks revenue, but they by no means goal every experiment on revenue. They're looking for things like retention, engagement, do they have healthy browsing activity, things like that. And then sometimes if you drive revenue in one area, you have to understand that might come at a trade-off. Is it possibly hurting another product? Is it if you are pushing a brand new product like Amazon Videos, for example, are you possibly taking users away from another product? I think sometimes these trade-offs are very important, and that's why Statsig very much encourages folks to look at a suite of metrics. And we also encourage folks to dive into their data. So if you have questions on an experiment, we do make it very easy to dive in and ask follow-up questions on, hey, we're worried about, iOS users and Android users. Like, can we get a split by OS? Or we're worried about whether this is cannibalizing this other product. Is there any way we can check in on some of their engagement metrics? And so in that, if you view it through that lens, because Statsig doesn't know your product, doesn't know what it is you're worried about, we don't make decisions for you and make recommendations. We instead make it easy to ask questions and get answers. And we think sometimes the decision-making can be nuanced, especially when there's a trade-off. Is it better to drive number of sessions? Is it better to drive time spent? Things like that. And if that's the case, that needs a human. And so we try not to rely on automated decision-making for a lot of these complex experimental effects. We do try to make it easy to get answers out of the system and to really understand whether this result can be trusted statistically.
Yeah.
But beyond that, we try to present the data to you as if you were looking at a dashboard.
Okay. The reason why I asked is because, you talk about making experimentation easy and so forth. And, I guess if someone's new to it, they just sort of want to turn it on and just let a computer tell them whether it's one or not. Hey, just going back to just one of the topics you wrote about, articles you wrote on the website, just to finish off with that, you talk about 95% stats rule. Let's put this in place. Just to clarify, do you have a hard and fast rule on 95%? Or would you?
Yeah. It's absolutely a trade-off between the sensitivity of your experiment. So I'm a big fan of 95% confidence intervals. I know folks will criticize it as it's arbitrary, and it absolutely is, but it's a great solid default. I think it's defensible because a lot of people use it. And what I think my main observation is that people who criticize 95% confidence intervals usually do it when they're looking at experimental results in order to convert a non-statistically significant result into a statistically significant result. And so obviously that's sort of cheating. You are changing the rules of the game after you've seen the result. And so while I'm not against folks who want to set a custom confidence interval of if you want to do 90%, 80%, or 99%, feel free, but you should do that before you set up the experiment. But I think you should also have strong justifications in picking those confidence intervals, because to be clear, those are arbitrary as well. But there's certainly circumstances that warrant, for example, if you wanted to really squash your false positive rate because you're exceptionally risk averse. For example, you may be working on integrity efforts or working on healthcare drug treatments. Then 99%, great. And on the flip side, if you're more worried about missing out on experimental effects and you're okay tolerating false positives, then by all means you can lower your confidence intervals. I just don't like it when folks try to change the numbers and the rules of the game and try to bias it one way or the other, especially after looking at the results. So I think 95% is a great solid default that folks should use and go with until they have learned a little bit more about their experimentation and their risk reward profile.
Say you're, I don't know, you're on 85% or whatever, and you've been running this test for a month, and you're like, okay, well, I can sort of see that these test results have stabilized. We got another test on the roadmap that's due to come out on Monday. The effects on, should we just hold on to this 95% rule and slow down our test velocity, or should we just sort of say, look, let's just sort of declare it as a winner? I'm sort of playing devil's advocate, but I'm just sort of...
Yeah. I mean, it really depends on your tolerance for false positives. I think there's an argument to be made that the control group is the default for a reason. Shipping new experiences can sometimes introduce like new technical overhead, or can introduce like changes to the user experience. There's a lot of reasons why, in just a given change, why you want to give the control group sort of that default. But if you're not worried about that, and you see an experiment that is where the test group is beating the control, but in a not statistically significant manner, I'm okay with like picking a winner, as long as you know that's not a statistically sound result, and you are taking a chance, that pretty strong chance that this is a false positive. But if there's really no cost to you, that's an okay way to make decisions as well. But I think in a lot of cases, folks want to. There's a reason why we follow this 95%, why we have implemented confidence intervals and p-values, is to control our false positive rates, because they are costly. And if you acknowledge that, you should stick with those rules of the game. And after 4 weeks, if you haven't seen the effect you needed to, it's also possible that effect is so small that it's not worth pursuing. That's the other case. Like if it was really such a great effect, you would have probably picked it up. It's probably neutral, or probably something not noteworthy. Like that's the other thing. So you're not missing out on a lot, in my opinion, when you're into those borderline cases. And it's best to move on to the next idea.
They've also got to consider the sort of, from a cost-benefit analysis, about productionizing this.
Yeah, I actually think there's a lot of costs to making a change on a website or on a product. And I think there's a lot of things we're not accounting for. I'll give an example. One is like you have existing users who may be used to a certain experience, and now they sort of have to adapt to a new experience. A second one is all of your other test results that you've been relying on have been done on that control group experience. So if you do ship a change, perhaps does that mean you have to revisit all of your other test results? Possibly. And then the sort of the third one that I can at least think of, and I'm guarantee you there's more, is that your engineers have sort of optimized a website for a given layout and a given configuration and a certain performance. And sometimes making those changes fast and frequently can introduce some thrash and can, in the long term, have some sort of degradation in performances and other things like that. I'm sure there's a lot of other hidden costs that are sort of really hard to enumerate, but that's why I think one should be careful about controlling those false positives. Now, there are some folks who have a pretty simple and tight website where like these changes are very easy to make, and those companies should absolutely play fast with the confidence interval, and go with things like 80% if there's low risk and they just need to try ideas and be able to get things out the door. That's fine. But I think one should not underestimate the cost of making changes.
Oh yeah, thanks for that. It's food for thought. It's an ongoing debate on the in that space. Anyway, thanks for your input on these topics and telling our audiences about your journey in StatSig. How can people contact you, Tim, if needs be?
Oh, absolutely. I am active on LinkedIn,
Yep.
and my follower count is pretty small. I would love to grow that if possible. So they can find me on linkedin.com/in/trchan, CHAN.
Cool. And it's statsig.com, right?
And then you can, and so you can also find me by following StatSig on LinkedIn, or our website is statsig.com. And we do have our own blog as well, where I do publish a few of my articles.
Cool. Looking forward to more articles and more sort of ones that go against the grain. No, I'm just joking. Awesome. Thanks for making it to the show. And we'll hopefully see you in the future.
Richard, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.